everyone. I'm Henry. I work on Babel. And yeah, this is my first VueConf, so thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about everything as compiler. So first, I'm going to just say that Tom Dale, he works on Ember. He wrote a blog post a while back called Compilers on New Frameworks. And so thinking about that post, I was like, oh, maybe Vue is a compiler, Ember is a compiler, everything is a compiler. And he's saying that if you want to do web development, maybe you should think about how compilers work. And I've been working on it for a while. And so I originally titled this talk Vue as compiler, but I realized I don't really know anything about how it works. So you should check out Rahul's talk, who's on the core team. And so what I really want to talk about is more of like a meta question around like this idea of epistemology. So we're going to get into a little philosophy here. Non-technical talk. I'm curious, why do we see things in a certain way? Why do we end up seeing everything as something? So how do we know? What can we know? Can we know anything at all? And you could explain this through the frequency illusion. Once you see something, you continue to see versions of that a lot. And you could just say that's like confirmation bias. Also, I'll just note that this picture might be a picture of what this talk is going to be like. So hopefully it makes sense. One example I just saw, like when I was walking over to the convention center today, I saw this, on the right, like a bunch of squares. And to me, I don't know if you see this too, but reminds me of the GitHub contribution graph. Maybe you walked into some restaurant or like the bathroom and all these tiles are all green and you're like, oh, they're doing really well too on GitHub. But yeah, when I talk about everything as compiler, I've been working on a compiler for, I guess, a few years now. And you'd think I have some idea of what that means. And I just say, something that you have to take these compiler classes in school, and people recommend you reading this thing called the Dragon book. It's very scary. Talking about dragons. I didn't study CS in school, so doesn't mean I have the vocabulary for how a compiler works, but there's like something maybe that I understand, but I don't know how to express it. The chemist turned philosopher, Michael Polanyi, he actually phrases this in terms of we can know more than we can tell. So there are things that we know that we might not be able to express in words. And he uses this idea of the tacit knowledge instead of explicit knowledge. And when I talk about Babel, a lot of us might say that it's just like backwards compatibility. What I say is like, if you ever use Windows and you had to like do that drop down for the program when it doesn't work, like, hey, I want to change it to Windows XP or 2000, then that's sort of like what Babel does. And similar to natural language, there is a project called Labab, which is literally the opposite of Babel. Babel does that backwards compatibility from new syntax to old, but we could do the opposite. And Jason just is working on something similar, where he wants to compile node modules so that we can kind of upgrade libraries if they don't output ES6. And similar to natural language, have you ever tried to run a translator back and forth multiple times? It'd be kind of interesting to see what would output when Babel runs and then Labab runs, and you just keep doing it until like, now you realize like how hard it is to translate things. And yeah, you can see in this way, everything is a compiler, right? Everything has input, output, and you're just transforming things. My point here is that that metaphors change how we think. They change how we interact with the world. Example is time is money. We like to say that the framework will save us time. We need to budget our time. I've invested a lot of time in configuring Babel. And in another way, even we talk about compiling. I can't parse what you're saying. I'm still compiling my thoughts. Let's generate some ideas. These are all like steps in Babel. And so in a way, knowledge is a type of insight. And I guess I've italicized sight here. It's a way of seeing the world. And so when we learn things, we end up seeing things through the thing that we're learning, whether it's like a state, like a government, or whatever it is. I like Polanyi's example of this idea of to from. We look to something, like we're looking at something, and then when we kind of learn to understand it better, we look from it. And so I think of it sort of like going from third person to first person in a video game, where you're analyzing this thing, but then later you can kind of embody it yourself. Steve Jobs liked to talk about how the computer is like a bicycle for the mind, another metaphor. This example is really interesting. There's a YouTube video that talks about this backwards bike where if you rotate it counterclockwise, the wheels turn clockwise. And here is an example of someone trying to, I guess, trick his brain by like kind of switching his arms, but clearly it doesn't work. And people think that they can do it, but we have that, you could say muscle memory, the neuroplasticity in our brain where it's difficult. Just because we think we can do it doesn't mean we can do that with our bodies. So this matters because this relates to how we code. Justin talks about how when you use Rails, for an example, or you use Vue, you think in the way of the creator. So for Rails, it could be DHH. For Vue, it could be for Evan and the team. There's sort of like the thinking behind how they think about the world. It's in the framework itself. And so a lot of people like to maybe complain about certain projects, maybe Redux in this case, and it's because sometimes we have a hard time using it because we don't understand the mental model behind it. It's hard to understand it without believing in it, quote unquote. Justin actually mentions like there's this sort of religious metaphor to it as well, and he quotes my tweet where I talk about from Polanyi's book that in a way, insight is sort of like a conversion experience, where like once you discover this thing, you become woke, I guess. You think differently, you think in a different language, you live in a different world. And I like also that Justin pointed out that having that kind of faith or having that sort of conversion experience, it's like getting a joke. Like before someone says it and you don't get it, it's just a bunch of words. And then once you understand, everything's different. C.S. Lewis has a great, from the literal point of view of religion, I think he understands it really well. The sun can literally be the light that we use to see everything, but then our beliefs can also help us understand the world as well. And you might think, how do we apply this to programming? So, one question that some people might ask is, isn't the whole point of programming to abstract people away so we don't have to think about it? When we abstract things, we kind of hide things. And so I think there's this feeling in open source that we don't really care about the people as much because the code is what matters, the artifact. And it's like almost like a lack of desire to kind of think about those people. There's obviously the extreme of like this like celebrity sort of thing too, but I think neglecting people can have issues. So one of the questions that you might ask is like, who is behind the code that we use? When you first start using open source or you start programming, you might not think about that, you just use it. It's just something that works. And you could say that case for Babel. A lot of times you might be using it, but you have no idea. And so the icons here, the default icons, your favorite people on GitHub are the people that have no icon because they can say whatever they want. And so abstraction hides details. In a way, open source hides our dependencies. And so that inevitably maybe means that we hide the people that work on these things. And I want to show the difference between driving a car versus maintaining a car or fixing a car or making a car. Same thing with the framework. We have to ask someone else to do it for us, like a mechanic or a maintainer. The difference between consumption and production is pretty different. And so what happens when we outsource? What happens when we defer responsibility to tools or for other people? I could apply this in a different way. We could think about the ecosystems of our ecology and environment. When we eat food and we go to a restaurant, we order, do we think about like all the systems that go behind that? And similarly with programming, do we think about all the work that got put in to make all this happen? So abstraction kind of hides things. And you could think of this in terms of accessibility as well. And so in programming, the results of the program are not the program. The docs aren't the program. The APIs aren't the program. Even the types aren't the program. There's all, in a way, just maps of the actual thing. So there's a phrase called the map is not the territory. And it's a way of describing the fact that we don't actually know reality in and of itself. Maybe you've heard of the law of leaky abstractions, where like all non-trivial abstractions are leaky. And so the map is our belief and the territory is reality. And there's this funny story about how, a fictional story of an empire that was, their cartographers were trying to map out the world, and they were trying to figure out a way to make it really detailed. So what they did was they made the map as big as the territory itself. And of course, at that point, it then becomes useless because you don't need the map anymore. And so there's this thing around, we want to be really detailed because we want to be correct. We want to be right. And so not that we shouldn't have any of these things, docs and APIs, we should definitely have them. It's just that they are in and of themselves not enough. And we need people to continue to maintain all these things. I think another way of putting this is just that, and this is rather depressing, but you can have 100% test coverage. That doesn't mean you're not going to have bugs. You can use all these standards in all these browsers. That doesn't mean you're not going to have bugs. You can work at the top companies. You can use all these open source projects. Everything will have bugs. And you might think at this point we should just give up. But I think maybe the question we should be asking is, what can we gain by doing things ourselves or learning how things work better? That maybe we shouldn't always rely on abstraction. But then you could go super skeptical and you could be like, well, should we rely on anything at all? Should we just start over? It's sort of like that thing where people are like, you're not a programmer if you don't do X. Like if you don't write your own programming language, if you don't make your own text editor, if you don't make your own language, should we trust people? I think this is similar to Descartes' view of the world, which is I think, therefore I am. He ended up criticizing everything except himself. He separated his mind and his body, and all of our philosophy, modern philosophy, stems from this kind of idea of skepticism, which is good because you want to be able to prove things. But what are the consequences of seeking this sort of quote-unquote objectivity, certainty, what is best, and learning from doubt? I think we should think about how the medium thing changes how we think. Just saying that the way things happen and the why and the how is just as important as the content itself. He wrote a book, Marshall McLuhan, called Understanding Media. And there's a book later called The Medium is the Message. One of the publishers had a typo and they called it massage. But he ended up thinking that was actually better, so he kept it in. And the reason is because the mediums that we use, you talk about social media technology, that does massage our brain in a way. It changes how we think. In tech, with digital stuff, it makes us not think about the space that we're in. It makes us think that we can be limitless, that we can get rid of time and space. And so, as people that are in tech, we think about how technology changes our society. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. One way of thinking about technology is that it's just an artifact. It's just like this dead thing that it exists. But, people talk about the singularity. People want to kind of make technology more than it actually is. I think there's a great essay by Aaron, talks about the metaphors we live by, that this metaphor of God as the singularity, people believe that, right? But it's difficult to kind of step back and think what do I believe? How do I see the world? So David Foster Wallace has this quote about how this is older fish that asks the younger fish, how's the water? And the younger fish is like, what's water? And it's because it's hard for you to realize what the environment you're in and how that affects who you are. And thinking about Babel, the project I work on, maybe you can recall the story of the Tower of Babel itself. It's a story about pride and our hubris as people to think that we can know everything with certainty. But we can't question everything. We can't be completely skeptical. At some point, you have to make a decision. You can't Google everything, use machine learning on everything, and make sure that I am objectively right. We have to make a decision at some point. And so, sort of like this quote, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Some of these things are needed. And so it's similar to say that abstraction has problems because it makes us not think about the underlying people, the issues, the ecosystem. But I think it'd be too easy to just say abstraction is bad. So the way I want to think about this now is there's an essay called Programming as Theory Building. This is by Peter Now, and he's the N in BNF form, if you're familiar with compilers. He asked the question, what is programming? And I think most people, most of us, and me too, we think that programming is about creating this piece of text. And this is the same as saying that open source is just code, or programming is just code. You can have a similar question in reading. What is reading? It's just remembering a bunch of facts or statements. I think about this book, which I haven't read either, called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. So I think I learned from it because I didn't read it yet. My friend Nadia has a great point about how sometimes you read books and then at the end of it you have no idea what you read, or there's no way for you to remember. But some of that reading, or when you talk to people, it changes how you see things. It changes how you see the world. And so maybe reading isn't really about these facts. per se, but about how it changes how you think, your mental model. So he asked the question in the essay, how else can we think about knowing? How else can we think about programming? Shelley had a great quote that a lot of coding isn't actually about coding. And as a maintainer that I've been doing for a while, I've realized that and you can even feel bad for not doing the code. Like as a maintainer, you're like, oh, I have to make all these commits, make all these PRs. And I think that resonated with me because as a maintainer now, if I do give a talk or I write docs or I'm just thinking or reading a book about something else that seems to have some clue to relate to programming, you feel bad because it's not measurable, it's not quantifiable. I can't tweet that I did that. But the work is still there and it might take a long time. It's short-term versus long-term in a way. And so their answer to not that programming is about artifacts and producing programs, but that programming is about creating these mental models. It's about how we think about programming itself. And so in that way, it's actually very personal. It's a thing that it changes over time. He says later that an essential part of programming is the theory of it. And later, that it could not conceivably be expressed, which is similar to Polanyi's thing that we know more than we can say, and is inextricably bound to human beings. So it's saying that there are things that we do when we have experience with it as maintainers that we can't pass on other than through mentorship and by just being around these people. And you can try, and we should try as hard as we can to document and to make videos and all these things. But at the end, people are essential, and we can't replace them. And later in the book, he talks about how McLuhan says that technologies are extensions of our physical and nervous systems. And so in a way, technology is not just this artifact. It actually becomes a part of ourselves. I like this word indwelling that Polanyi uses to talk about how we do learn. And it's this idea of internalization. Like when you understand something, it becomes a part of you. And this is similar to what I think is, Bruce Lee is not a programmer, but maybe he could have been. He talks about this idea of water, be like water, adjust to the object, empty your mind, be shapeless, all that. Be water, my friend. I think that he understood what it meant to kind of embody the things that you believe. And I like this idea that technology is a living thing. It's not only dead, it could be both. It has to be practiced for the knowledge to be maintained. So if someone abandons their project, if I stop working about what is going to happen, yeah, you could still use the code and it will run. But then when we have to change it, when there's a bug, someone's going to have to maintain it. A great example of this is this shrine in Japan where every generation of people, they actually rebuild the whole thing after taking it down. And so it talks about how you could talk about programming in terms of this life cycle. And we talk about life cycles all the time in frameworks. During that life cycle, the life of a program, the team of people that work on it, they possess a theory about how it works. The death of the program happens when the group of people don't understand the theory anymore, even though the code will still work. You can make this equivalent to urban planning in cities. Jane Jacobs was someone that tried to understand a bit about how certain groups of people saw the city, and it saw the city in a way that was more about how it was about buildings rather than about the people that live in them. And so in a world that's broken, then maybe we should think differently about how we maintain it. And that in that life cycle, there is a revival of the program when we re-understand how these things work. And that will change too. So the point with all that is that programmers are not resources. Sometimes business people would like to say oh, we don't have enough resources. But yeah, people are not necessarily substitutable because of this inherent personal knowledge that they have. So when we're thinking about things, maybe we should think about what we're dealing with. Is it about, and not that this has to be a clear dichotomy, but I think it's interesting to think about the difference between knowing something like the content versus know-how, which is kind of like the skills that we have when we were playing an instrument, learning programming, or anything like that. Cats. Is what we're dealing with a cat or a toaster? Is it a living thing or is it a mechanical thing? You could take apart the toaster, put it back together, and that'd be totally fine, but you would definitely not want to do that with a cat. And so with the city analogy, is the city just a building, or is it this whole ecosystem that's very complicated and it takes a lot of work to figure out how it works? The environment, same way. Open source, is open source about code, or is it about code and people? Not that code isn't important. Sometimes we just, we go down this certain path where like code is the only thing that matters. And so, yeah, how do we see the world? This perspective shapes how we think about it. And maybe we should kind of take a step back to see where we are. Not that we can actually get to a point where it's a higher vantage point that's objective, but kind of in the end, we do have to make a decision. Yeah. So that's all I have. But yeah, it's been 2 years since I left my job at Behance to do open source full time. I did talk to Evan when I quit, and I was so scared. I took like a year to think about it. Yeah, it's been kind of amazing. Unfortunately, a lot of the raising money part looks like this. This was at like a previous conference, like I think a year ago at React Rally, when I guess I was like really sad at the time. But it's going better. Yeah, and I do this full time now. I'm the only full-time person on Babel. We have a few volunteers that we're trying to pay part-time, hopefully full-time. So yeah, thanks.